is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 469, the Semi-Quincentennial Congressional Time Capsule Act. This nonpartisan legislation would authorize a time capsule to be buried on the Capitol grounds to mark the nation's semi-quincentennial. America is turning 250 on July 4, 2026. This time capsule presents one way that Congress will participate in the nation's year-long celebration of democracy and freedom. Amongst our toughest challenges of the day, this legislation reminds us that we can all work together. The contents of the capsule will be selected by the Speaker of the House, House Minority Leader, and the majority and minority leaders in the United States Senate. Maybe we can even ask Speaker Johnson to include a pair of his glasses. The capsule will remain sealed until July 2nd, 2276, the nation's 500th anniversary.
That was Congressman Brian Stile, the Wisconsin Republican, talking on the House floor February 26, 2025, about America 250 and a time capsule. He was joined by Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. The New Jersey Democrat is co-founder and co-chair of the America 250 caucus.
This bill will authorize, as we have heard, the architect of the Capitol to create a time capsule and have it buried on the West Lawn to remain sealed until July 4th, 2276, the nation's 500th anniversary. The contents will include items that represent important legislation and institutional milestones of Congress, a message from the 119th Congress to the 244th Congress, and other items that reflect our history. No one here today will see it opened, but an old Greek proverb says, "A society grows great when the old plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in."
With America celebrating the 4th of July in 2025 and planning for America 250 underway, this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly joins in the national spirit of patriotism. It's a podcast about America and time capsules. Our focus, time capsules and the American presidency. We'll start with Thomas Jefferson. The day before the 4th of July in 1995, C-SPAN talked about the third president. It was an interview with Steve Moore of the National Park Service. The topic, the Jefferson Memorial. Construction of the Jefferson Memorial began in 1938. It was completed in 1943, and it has a time capsule.
I understand there in the cornerstone and the time capsule are 4 newspapers from that time period, the Washington Star and the Washington Post and the Times Herald and the Daily News. What was the purpose of putting things like that in a time capsule?
Well, as I understand it, the purpose was that this would provide a record of Jefferson and what he represented and the times during which the memorial was constructed, in case there should ever be some sort of a catastrophe and nothing would remain to explain why it was there.
In 2008, C-SPAN took its audience on a special tour of the White House, examining the history of grounds and gardens. Among the artifacts, a time capsule that President Bush buried in 1992 to mark the 200th birthday of the White House.
As one president prepares to make way for another, the familiar and reassuring backdrop of the White House grounds and gardens symbolize the continuity of the presidency. In 1992, in the shade of the Kennedy saucer magnolia at the Rose Garden's edge, a time capsule was buried as an expression of faith in that continuity, a confidence that dates back to President George Washington. Somewhere on these grounds, no one knows quite where, the original cornerstone was set. The stone bore a brass plate dated October 13, 1792, and declared that it was set in place in the 17th year of the independence of the United States of America. The first name below that declaration was George Washington, President. The inscription concluded with a Latin motto, Vivat Republica, long live the Republic. If all goes according to plan, the time capsule planted in 1992 will be opened on the country's 300th birthday.
Just a few blocks from the White House, there's another time capsule, the National Millennium Time Capsule. It's at the National Archives and will be opened in the year 2100. First Lady Hillary Clinton talked about its contents during opening ceremonies of America's Millennium Celebration, December 31st, 1999.
There will be a photo of Rosa Parks in the days after that fateful bus ride to serve to remind us not only of her courage, but of our solemn pledge to move forward in the long march toward justice and to live even closer to our ideals of freedom and equality. The model of the DNA double helix will be placed in the capsule, not just as a symbol of one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of all history, but of our commitment to completing the Human Genome Project, cracking the code of life, and putting it to work for the good of humanity. And the film of Neil Armstrong's Walk on the Moon must also be our pledge to keep America the world's leading spacefaring nation.
By the way, a week after Hillary Clinton talked about a time capsule, so did her husband's vice president. In January 2000, Al Gore was campaigning for president in Iowa. He told a Des Moines audience what he would put in a time capsule. And what was it? Legislation.
I honestly believe here we are at the beginning of this new era. We've all heard all the hoopla about the millennium and all the predictions that were made 100 years ago that were comically wrong, and all the predictions that are made now, and most of them will be wrong, but I'm going to make one here. I'm going to say this, that if our civilization survives another 1,000 years, if I had a time capsule to be opened 1,000 years from now that would tell people what our generation was like and describe our finest achievements, if I was going to pick just a handful of things that would say about us the best that could be said, one of the things that I would include is Tom Harkin's Americans with Disabilities Act to lift up those with disabilities all across this nation. It expresses the best of the human spirit, and we thank you, Tom Harkin.
Here's someone else who had an idea what to put in a time capsule, Ronald Reagan. As we heard during his closing statement during the 1984, here's someone else who had an idea what to put in a time capsule, Ronald Reagan. As we heard during his closing statement during the October 1984 second presidential debate with Walter Mondale.
Several years ago, I was given an assignment to write a letter. It was to go into a time capsule and would be read in 100 years when that time capsule was opened. I remember driving down the California coast. One day my mind was full of what I was going to put in that letter about the problems and the issues that confront us in our time and what we did about them. But I couldn't completely neglect the beauty around me, the Pacific out there on one side of the highway shining in the sunlight, the mountains of the coast range rising on the other side. And I found myself wondering what it would be like for someone, wondering if someone 100 years from now would be driving down that highway and if they would see the same thing. And with that thought, I realized what a job I had with that letter. I would be writing a letter to people who know everything there is to know about us. We know nothing about them. They would know all about our problems. They would know how we solved them and whether our solution was beneficial to them down through the years or whether it hurt them. They would also know that we lived in a world with terrible weapons, nuclear weapons of terrible destructive power, aimed at each other, capable of crossing the ocean in a matter of minutes and destroying civilization as we knew it. And then I thought to myself, what are they going to say about us? What are those people 100 years from now going to think? They will know whether we used those weapons or not. Well, what they will say about us 100 years from now depends on how we keep our rendezvous with destiny. Will we do the things that we know must be done and know that one day down in history, 100 years or perhaps before, someone will say, thank God for those people back in the 1980s.
If that time capsule story sounds familiar, it might be because you remember Ronald Reagan telling the same story 8 years earlier at the 1976 Republican Convention.
If I could just take a moment and I had an assignment the other day. Someone asked me to write a letter for a time capsule that is going to be opened in Los Angeles 100 years from now on our tricentennial. It sounded like an easy assignment. They suggested I write something about the problems and issues of the day, and I set out to do so, riding down the coast in an automobile, looking at the blue Pacific out on one side and the Santa Ynez Mountains on the other, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was going to be that beautiful 100 years from now as it was on that summer day. And then, as I tried to write, let your own minds turn to that task. You're going to write for people 100 years from now who know all about us. We know nothing about them. We don't know what kind of a world they'll be living in. And suddenly, I thought to myself, if I write of the problems, they'll be the domestic problems of which the President spoke here tonight, the challenges confronting us, the erosion of freedom that has taken place under Democrat rule in this country, the invasion of private rights, the controls and restrictions on the vitality of the great free economy that we enjoy. These are our challenges that we must meet. And then again, there is that challenge of which he spoke, that we live in a world in which the great powers have poised and aimed at each other horrible missiles of destruction, nuclear weapons that can in a matter of minutes arrive in each other's country and destroy virtually the civilized world we live in. And suddenly it dawned on me, those who would read this letter 100 years from now will know whether those missiles were fired. They will know whether we met our challenge.
A historical footnote, the 1976 convention where Ronald Reagan told the time capsule story, it was in Kansas City. And the 1984 debate where Ronald Reagan told the same time capsule story, well, that was in Kansas City too. Now let's go to the aftermath of 9/11, 9 months after the terror attacks. On June 11th, 2002, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz placed what the Pentagon called a dedication capsule behind the last piece of limestone put into place, completing the repair of the facade of the Pentagon after the attack. The day before, Assistant Secretary of Defense Charlie Abel described the contents.
These are the contents of the capsule. This is the capsule itself. Not meant to be a time capsule, but a dedication capsule. The difference being we don't intend to dig this out at any specific date in the future and have it available for historians and the curious. We just expect it to be there to commemorate the victims and the rebuilding effort and the war on terrorism. It's, as you can see up here, there are a number of things that will go in it. We have a coin from the Secretary of Defense, a coin from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We have patches and a pin from the first responders, both the police and the firefighters. We have a copy of the President's address to the nation, that very stirring and inspiring press speech. We have a copy of the President and the Secretary visiting the site soon after the attack, and it's signed by the President. We have a joint resolution of the Congress. We have a small plaque here with all the victims' names listed. We have here a book that contains over 46,000 names of those who sent thank you cards in. We have a pin and the program from the memorial ceremony that was on October 11th. We have the patch worn by the construction crews that says "Let's roll." We have two cards representing the thousands and thousands of cards and plaques that were sent to the Pentagon. Obviously done by children. It'll be in there to remember it.
Another military institution, Arlington National Cemetery. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson placed a memorabilia box in the cornerstone of the Memorial Amphitheater at the cemetery. 105 years later, in April 2020, it was opened. What was inside? Here's Arlington National Cemetery historian Tim Frank.
And there was a copy of the Declaration of Independence, copy of the Constitution, which I might note it was before Prohibition and before women had the right to vote. There was a United States flag, which happened to be 46 stars instead of 48. So someone probably found whatever flag was on hand to put in. There's a congressional directory, and there were some congressional hearings on the Memorial Amphitheater. President Wilson presented an autographed photograph of himself. The Memorial Amphitheater Commission had actually added a Confederate veteran in the Public Buildings Act of 1915, and so his contribution was a list of Confederate dead.
Think discovering a picture of Woodrow Wilson in a time capsule is a delight? Well, how about opening a time capsule and discovering a picture of Rutherford B. Hayes? That's what awaited Senate historian Don Ritchie as he told a C-SPAN caller in May 2006.
Now let's go to Virginia Beach, Virginia. You're on the air.
Yes, first, thank you so much for what a wonderful program you've put out so far. I've really enjoyed it. My question is time capsules. Are there time capsules on this property? Have you all discovered any, and are there going to be in the future more time capsules? Thank you.
There have been, I think, various time capsules. I was present in 1976 when we actually opened a safe that was essentially a time capsule that had been given to the government in 1876. And President Ford came to the Capitol just before the bicentennial and opened the safe. We had no idea what was inside. There were pictures of Rutherford B. Hayes and his wife and other items that were donated at the time of the first centennial.
Some time capsules can't be found, like the one for Lewis and Clark. On May 21st, 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt rode into Portland, Oregon in a horse-drawn carriage. He gave a rousing speech about Lewis and Clark, and he put a copper box into the cornerstone of a towering monument to that great pioneering duo of the Pacific Northwest. Inside that copper box, relics of American life in 1903, such as a 2-cent stamp, pennies made from 1900 to 1903, the Portland City Charter, the 29th Annual Report of the Public Schools of Portland, a piece of rock salt, and, well, you guessed it, Roosevelt included a portrait of Roosevelt. 100 years later, preparing for a May 28, 2003 ceremony marking the 200th anniversary of Lewis and Clark's expedition, Portland historians discovered that they couldn't discover the time capsule. Here is President Theodore Roosevelt's great-grandson, Theodore Roosevelt IV.
Well, this is certainly sort of one of the most unusual bicentennial events that I've ever attended. The raison d'etre being, of course, the time capsule buried here in May of 1903, which is decided to remain lost in time. I would like to draw on some symbolic significance of the fact that it's lost, but quite frankly, I was unable to do so. I understand that the local chapter of the Theodore Roosevelt Association has agreed to and will contribute to the restoration of the monument, so perhaps additional historical elbow grease will help in unearthing more clues as to where the time capsule may ultimately be.
And here's something else no one can find, the original cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol. It was laid on Wednesday, September 18th, 1793, during the first large public event staged in the federal city. It was placed on top of an engraved metal plate, which George Washington himself buried. In 1991, the architect of the Capitol, the office now charged with creating the America 250 time capsule, conducted a search for the Capitol cornerstone. They used a metal detector to try to locate the engraved plate, but they did not find it. In 1993, for the bicentennial of the Capitol, C-SPAN talked with the architect of the Capitol, George White.
And when it occurred to some of us that now that we were going to have the 200th anniversary, it might be nice to locate it if we could find it. It's really just kind of an interesting experiment, because it really doesn't make any difference whether we find it or not. We know it's someplace. We think we have found it, but we can't say positively because the silver plate is not there. We can't locate that, and we think it was probably lost when the excavation took place and nobody thought of looking here. They looked carefully at the other location, and of course, since it wasn't there, they never found it. So we think it's gone, and
we hope the architect of the Capitol for the 244th Congress has better luck finding the America 250 congressional time capsule on July 4th, 2276. And now a bonus clip And for that, we travel way back in time, all the way back to 1939 and the World's Fair in legendary Flushing Meadows, New York. That's when the term time capsule was first used. The Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company created a 50-foot deep concrete-lined hole. They dropped the torpedo-shaped Westinghouse time capsule into it, and Westinghouse made a film about it.
Time capsule of cupelloi, deposited on the site of the New York World's Fair on September 23, 1938, by the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. If anyone should come upon this capsule before the year AD 6939, let him not wantonly disturb it, for to do so would be to deprive the people of that era of the legacy here left them. Cherish it, therefore, in a safe place.
5,000 years from now, the peoples of the future will look back on us as we look back on the early Egyptians and Babylonians. The time capsule down there is actually a message from our time to theirs. Those who open and study it will know more about us than any man living today.
And in case you think the people of 6939 will be besides themselves with joy when they have the chance to learn about the people of 1939, there's another reason they won't be able to contain their excitement. Because there is another time capsule. 15 years later, Westinghouse did it again. They buried a second time capsule at the same spot at the 1964 World's Fair. That one, too, will be opened in 6939 by the inhabitants of presumably still legendary Flushing Meadows. For now, we're just happy to have our own time capsule. It's a time capsule we like to call the C-SPAN Video Library. And you don't have to wait. You can use it right now. That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. Thanks for listening. Happy searching. Happy 4th of July. And for our special closing music, we return to C-SPAN's special in the White House grounds and gardens. We end this podcast the same way the 2008 program ended, with the President's Own, the United States Marine Band.